Hello, everybody. I'm here with Josh today. Hi, Josh. Thanks for coming
Hello.
back.
No worries. Good to see you.
We're gonna. This is sort of an off-the-cuff one, but I'm going to start with an enneagram quote from In Search of the Miraculous, because many of you on my YouTube channel have been asking, why haven't I done an enneagram show? Well, I find the enneagram quite complicated. I don't believe in this new age stuff that's been coming out lately about what type you are and that each number's a different type. I come from the Gurdjieff side of it, and he never mentioned types with the link to the Enneagram, as far as I know. But maybe Josh will correct me with that. We'll see. But I'm going to do a quote from In Search of the Miraculous, and people have been asking for page numbers.
Oh no.
Page 287. The symbol, which takes the form of a circle divided into 9 parts with lines connecting them together, expresses the law of 7 in its union with the law of 3. This construction shows the inner laws of 1 octave, and it points out a method of cognizing the essential nature of a thing examined in it. The isolated existence of a thing or phenomenon is the closed circle of an eternally returning and uninterruptedly flowing process. The circle symbolizes this process. The separate points in the division of the circumference symbolize the steps of this process. So it is a process, the Enneagram. Josh, please discuss.
Okay, I'll do my best. But I was just going to say that we did do a talk. I think it was the last one we did on the law of 7 and the octave. So there's probably quite a lot of I think we did cover a bit of the Enneagram in that. So I'm just saying, I suppose if people haven't watched that and they want to, they can have a look and they might find some bits there useful. And I'll also mention again the same thing I mentioned in that talk, that there are some books out there about the Enneagram from the work tradition rather than the personality tradition. And 2 books that I've read and I would recommend are one by J.G. Bennett, who was a pupil of Gurdjieff. I think that's called Enneagram Studies or something like that. And another one by Anthony Blake, who again was a student of Bennett, who did a book called The Intelligent Enneagram. So there's quite a lot of good, I would say, good material in there. Lots of different ways that they look at it rather than just say in one context. But yeah, I tend to agree with you that it's not. I mean, you could look at it that way. You could look at the nature of essence types and things through the. You could use the Enneagram as a tool to explore those ideas, because you could say that in essence you could use the Enneagram to look at anything. It could serve as a means to explore something. Like a kind of a lens that you could look. That you could analyze something through. So you could use it that way. But yeah, like you say, he doesn't really introduce it in that context. He introduces it in a much, like you say, a much wider context, where he says everything. It expresses the laws that are involved in everything, in the created universe, like you say, the law of 3 and the law of 7. So yeah, it seems to be like the symbol is composed of you could say three symbols, in one. So there's, like you say, the circle, which, like you were saying, kind of represents the thing or the phenomena in question as regarded as a whole, something in itself that has its own, to an extent, independent existence or its own nature. And it kind of expresses the persistence of that thing or phenomena. So like he says, it kind of represents a cycle. In order for anything to persist through time, to have some being in time, it has to have this kind of cyclic element to it, like a process of renewal. So that's even applies to what we would take to be inanimate matter, a cup. In order for it to persist through time, to exist, there is an internal process in it where it's kind of, you could say, renewing its existence, or it's maintaining its existence. So you could look at that circle in a basic sense, if we were talking about a cup or something, then that circle would be involved in something like the atomic bonds, something, that process and the electrons. So there's some activity going on there, even in inanimate matter, that enables it to, stay together, to keep its shape, to keep its being, to keep its essence. So in terms of a thing, you could look at the circle as its basic sort of being or existence, its edge, it's enclosed in the circle. And that involves, a linear kind of cyclic process through time. So if we were looking at a thing or a process, then you look at the circle in terms of its linear existence through time and how it kind of goes through a cycle of repetition in order to persist through time. So along this the circumference of the circle, you have the numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and you can look at that in terms of a clockwise progression. That, you move around from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and that's like, the outer. That would be kind of like the external or visible side of the phenomenon or process, that you engage, you could say, through the senses and like, through space and time. And then within the circle, there's a triangular figure, and obviously that triangular figure has its points on the number 9 and 3 and 6, and that kind of corresponds. The points of those triangle corresponds to the shocks, like that are mentioned in the nature of the octave or the law of 7. That there are these points of shocks where something has to be done or introduced, you could say, from outside, if you like, in order for this thing or process to persist. So again, in that sense, these kind of points of the triangle or the points of shock, they sort of represent openings whereby the thing, the phenomena or the process is connected to other things and other processes. The shocks are its kind of means of interaction with the world outside of the thing. And again, those openings are integral to its own being and persistence. Like we said, in order for that circle to continue its existence, to persist, and that's that kind of cyclic progression to keep repeating, like going round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then beginning again. In order for that to continue, it needs to receive something from outside, and that's like put in terms of energy. Like the cup needs to interact with the whole field of the universe and everything else in order to receive some kind of energy, if you like, that it uses in order to maintain itself. So in that sense, the openings and the shocks kind of represent the kind of like almost the mutuality of every existing phenomena, that it has to be mutual and like permeable to other existing phenomena in order to exist. So you can see the triangle in that side, in that sense, kind of represents, you can connect it with the inner essence of the phenomena in question, and what is in common between that essence or that phenomena or that process and all other processes. There has to be something that makes the cup mutual. Like the cup can't just exist in isolation from the rest of the universe, and it has to have something obviously in common with the rest of the universe, in order to persist and be. So you've got those 3 points of shock that are linked to the triangle, and obviously the triangle there expresses kind of like the law of 3. And then the third figure that composes the symbol, which is again obviously inside the circle, is a kind of, you could say, kind of like a hexad figure, because it's a figure that's composed of 6 points. And like you say, in terms of the numbers, it sort of goes 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7. That's the kind of, they're the numbers that that compose the figure, the points. And so that sort of hexad figure represents the law of 7, and like you could say the law of the octave. And obviously that figure, in terms of the numbers, like 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, it has a different sequence to it than the circular sequence of numbers. Like obviously the circular sequence kind of goes in order, whether clockwise or anti-clockwise, but this inner hexad figure, law of 7, doesn't kind of operate in a sort of linear fashion. So again, like inside the circle, this phenomena or process, there has to be these 2 laws, you could say, or these 2 elements, the law of 3 and the law of 7, and they operate in order to enable it to persist and be, and to enter into relation with everything else. And that sort of hexad figure, like we said, it's non-linear, so it kind of suggests that in order for something to exist in time and to go through like linear process, a linear cyclic process, there has to be some kind of non-linear process within it. So like as the thing or phenomena is going through its linear cycle, simultaneously there has to be this inner process that kind of operates in a different way. It's almost like in order to go through linear time, there has to be some kind of non-linear time, in which case this non-linear time is not operating in the normal sense of like moving from the past, moving from the present, so to speak, to the future. It'd have to represent some other kind of interaction between like the future and the present. And one way that Gurdjieff, I suppose, kind of points to that is by saying that, I think he only expresses it in one sense, where he says when you get to a certain, I think he expresses it with the last shock. So if you got all the way around to sort of, I think like 0.8, it kind of says that when you get there, there's an influence from the dough. You know, like if you got to the note C, then the next note is dough, and that's like, you know, you could say represents the completion, or at least the start of a new cycle. That if you get to that point, you kind of like get pulled forward by the dough. So it's like it kind of almost represents an influence from the future. You know, it's like in any in order for like any state of matter to go through a change, like a solid to a liquid or something like that, it's like it has to receive an influence from the state that it's moving to. Like in order for a solid to say transform to a liquid, it has to like receive an influence from, you could say, the future, or from that future state that it's trying to move towards. So there's a, like within the linear cycle and process, there is this non-linear process. And if we were looking at that in terms of our own experience, it's like in order to kind of ensure that a linear process is completed, in my mind, I need to be able to look ahead and behind, you know, in order to like locate myself in the process or in the enneagram. You know, I need to be able to see the kind of the steps that I've already progressed through and the steps that are, you know, that I want to move towards, in order to know where I am in that process, and by that knowledge know kind of what I need to do. So you could see that inner figure in terms of our normal kind of like function, kind of, you could say, represents something like the nature of the mind, you know, because like the mind is that part of us that's not sort of just limited to the present. It can, you know, think about the past and the future. So again, just this, there needs to be that something of that nature of the mind that, yeah, can account for the past and the future in order to be able to maintain or ensure that the present moves in the direction that you want.
So it's still concentrating you in the now, but using,
yeah,
like what you've just said, it's kind of really quite making sense for me actually. That looking behind, looking ahead, but using what you have got now to keep going.
Yeah, it's like that sort of knowledge of the enneagram, at least in terms of that sort of hexadic figure. Yeah, it's what you use to navigate. You know, you could say it's like a map, and so the map kind of, it has the destination and also like where you've come from. So you can use that to locate yourself. And it's, I suppose you could look at it in the same way in terms of like something like remembering yourself. You know, like obviously I have my bodily presence, my bodily nature, like you say, which is situated just in the moment, in the now. But then I also have, you could say, your attention. The nature of the attention would link, again, would be similar to that hexadic figure, in the sense that your attention can move around within your circle nature. You know what I mean? Your phenomena, what do you say? Your nature as a phenomenon. You know, your bodily nature or something like that. So you could, again, your attention has that sort of non-linear, that kind of non-linear nature to it. So, like again, if I wanted to remember myself, I could know that I need to do certain things with my attention in order to remember myself, you know. And again, with the work, that could be like, you know, dividing your attention or trying to maintain part of your attention in your body, part of your attention on yourself, and part of your attention on what you're doing. So that would be like another way of looking at that sort of inner hexadic figure. And another, like a classic, I don't know if Gurdjieff introduced it that way, but I think a classic example or like way of looking at the enneagram would be like the metaphor of the kitchen, like, or that process of cooking a meal, you know, in which case the kind of well, I suppose that if you were looking at the enneagram, it would be the right hand side, you know, the first half of it, from sort of, you know, 1 round to 4. Then that kind of mainly concerns sort of what would be kind of like the external side of the process. Let's say if we were cooking a meal in the kitchen, then that first side of the enneagram concerns like all the processes that you do in the kitchen in order to prepare. So like you might have to come into the kitchen, maybe clean up, or, you know, get the tools prepared, and then the first point of shock would be like the introduction of the food, you know. So that's of something of a different nature to like the kitchen and the utensils in the kitchen. Like this, it's different, you know, because the food is like organic, it's living, even though it might be, you know, it might be dead now, but it represents something of a different quality or a different nature. So that all that first side of the enneagram would be like preparing the kitchen, getting the tools out, and sort of all the material processes that you would do with the food prior to cooking. You know, I might be mixing different foods together or chopping them up. So you could see that first side kind of corresponds to the material processes that are involved in cooking. Then, we're looking at it through that lens. And then the second sort of side of the enneagram would be more like the inner nature. You know, the second shock, you could say, the second point of the triangle would be like putting the food into the fire or something like that. You know, so there'd be like there's a different element introduced there in terms of fire and heat and cooking. Or you could look at that second shock there in terms of the people. You know, they enter in order to eat the food, and again, they have a very different nature to the tools and the material processes that are involved in that. So you can say those two shocks then, like point 3 and 6, they represent the introduction of something of a different nature or a different quality that has to enter into that process. And I suppose, like, when you talk about going through the stages linearly, in order to pass a shock, he kind of says that the note or the place that you're at prior to the shock has to come up to the same sort of vibration or quality of the shock in order to pass it, you know? So
I wonder if that's where it comes in with the whole of, you've got to push yourself to do it, and if you don't, then you fall away and you don't complete that cycle.
Yeah, it's just that it would be like you have to have a certain affinity. You have to, you know, that stage has to reach a certain quality that is mutual with the nature of the shock that you're at in order to pass it. You have to become compatible to it. And so, like you say, though, the processes prior to the shocks kind of represent like almost like a build-up, you could say, of energy, so such that it comes to a level that it can pass the shock or reach the next stage. And that's kind of like what we were saying with the influence of the higher dough, that you kind of have to become close enough to that, mutual enough to that, so that you can make the connection can be made and the transformation or the shock can be passed. So yeah, I was just going to say that the first shock, then you could look at it as something that's kind of more of like an external or outer nature, like I suppose in Search for Miraculous, in terms of like a human being and their work on themselves. He says that the first shock is linked to kind of like your attention and consciousness. Like he links it with making an effort to be kind of present or aware of yourself at the moment of just like receiving impressions, you know. So you could look at that as a kind of an action that's more to do with your sort of outer nature, if you like, more something that's on the surface of your being, you know, something that you do at that level with, let's say, your attention then. And then the second shock, he links it to an emotional, something that's more of an emotional nature. And so you can see that second shock is something that's at a deeper level than just you kind of doing something. Do you see what I mean? That second shock has to penetrate more into like your very essence, your very heart, in which case it's not the same kind of action that you're engaged in the first shock. It's not really something that you can do at that sort of normal level of intentionality, you know. It has to be something that would be like concerning your very essence. And you can see the difference between like the first shock of like receiving the food in the kitchen and doing something with that, and then like the second shock being like the actual eating of the food, you could say, you know. Like the first shock, you're working on the food from outside, and then in the second shock, well, that food enters into you and it's kind of becomes part of you. There's like chemical, you know, transformations that happen. So you can see that the first shock is kind of a more outer nature, like manipulation of matter, you could say, whereas the second shock would be like an actual inner transformation of the matter, you know, itself. It'd be like transformation on like molecular or atomic level, you know. So you could equate that with yourself. The first shock happens is something that you do at a more surface level of your being, and the second shock has to be something that, yeah, like literally is at the level of your essence itself, you know.
It's interesting you said it like that. I like that way, because I was told the same kind of thing, but from a work point of view. Someone was trying to explain to me how to put the enneagram to me doing the Gurdjieff work. And that first half, like you were saying, in the kitchen, getting the tools together, well, that's beginning to do the exercises, beginning to work on yourself. You know, practice makes perfect.
Yeah.
Well, practice, what's it? Make it till you fake it till
you
make it.
Yeah.
You know? And then you get past that first shock, which then pushes you on to actually doing it, whether you're not faking it anymore, you're actually trying to make it, but it's not quite, it's still almost there. And then the next half of the enneagram is you doing it, but having to keep doing it, because I know many people, like I've said in my shows before, I've talked about I think there's going to be a ta-da, and there isn't. It's subtle, isn't it, how suddenly you realize, I'm doing it. But then I suppose you get that next shock that wakens you to the fact that, yes, I'm doing it. And then you put more effort in because you suddenly realize it can happen.
Yeah, well, I suppose like you're saying, you could look at that first side of the enneagram, like in terms of maybe the acquisition, like you're saying, of different techniques and tools, and like the acquiring of certain knowledge and stuff like that. And then, like you say, at some point there has to be something deeper or some change that you're not just engaging in these, you're not just applying these tools to yourself. That the work has to like enter into you. You have to, like you say, almost become the work at that point, rather than it just being at the level of you using some sort of techniques and things that you've acquired. So yeah, it's something much deeper. Like you have to, at that side of it, you have to like to be. You could look at the first side as like to know, and then like the second side to be, and then I suppose the top point would be like to do. Like I think he does have that on his prospectus diagram, the enneagram. He has that funny little symbol, with like all with the, as like the eagle and the bull. I think it's the lion and the lamb.
Lion and the man,
and,
the Gospels, yes.
Yeah, so it has that figure, and it's designed such that it kind of mirrors the points. It looks like that. So I think in that prospectus, he has those three words on it, like to know, to be, to do. So you could look at the first half of the enneagram as like to know, knowledge. The second half is like being, and like those two coming together in doing or understanding.
Because I find it quite interesting. People talk about it moving, and I used to have real problems visualizing it moving. And you've got your circle going round, the actual enneagram. What did you call it? The
hexad. Hexad, I suppose. Yeah.
But I couldn't figure out whether they meant that was moving around the circle, if they meant that's moving from 1 to 4 to 2 to 8 to 5 to 7, or does it also mean that's going round, turning round?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's tricky because, like, he talks about the enneagram in saying that there's the progression clockwise around it, so there's that kind of evolutionary progression, but at the same time it expresses the nature of involution. So you could say you've got movements going clockwise and anti-clockwise. You could look at it as representing evolution and involution, in which case they're two similar movements but different. But yeah, I know what you mean. Like he does say that it's he says it's kind of like a moving symbol, like the enneagram, it's in motion, so you can't really be fully displayed in a static diagram. There's limits to what you can convey through a static symbol or picture if what they're trying to refer to is like a moving process. So I think he does in that context where he says that it's a moving symbol. I think he says like something like you need to participate in the movements or something like that, because in the movements you could say they're all based on the nature of the enneagram. A lot of the movements, what they're expressing through the people is this process, how the points move, or what the nature of the inner relationships are between those points. Like you said, there's a cyclic movement, and then there's like this heptadic, hexadic movement, and then there's the triangular sort of movement.
You mean the movements, Gurdjieff's movements you're talking about here? Yeah, sort of thought.
Yeah.
Just
so
clarifying.
So I think he says that one of the, a good way to get a deeper understanding of them, the enneagram, would be to participate in like something like the movements, or particularly the movements, because he says that it's structured according to the enneagram, according to those laws. So by participating in the kind of movement, you can maybe get the enneagram in a sort of deeper way. And again, doing the movements, they kind of provide a different means of learning. Like you're not really contemplating the enneagram with your mind when you're doing the movements. You're getting that kind of knowledge through your body. Your body is it's doing the movements. It's operating in terms of the sort of the enneagram, the laws there, and it's possible that the body kind of can understand that or get that knowledge, and that can kind of be like communicated to you.
Yeah, because knowledge doesn't just come through the brain, does it? Or through
the
mind,
exactly.
I should say. There's different ways of learning things.
Yeah, so it's like you say, I suppose, in his like nature, his idea of man of having like three brains, you'd need to study the enneagram with your three brains. You'd need to study it in a mental sort of way, which could be through, it could be through diagrams or pondering the ideas, or trying to look at phenomena and processes in terms of the enneagram. And you also need to study it through your emotions, your feelings, which could be a different way. I mean, you could get that kind of knowledge through looking at art or something like that, or poetry, things that are not even explicitly connected to the enneagram. You could get a kind of a knowledge of that through engaging with what we would call like emotional food, and then also your body, But I think he does kind of almost say the body is a prime means of kind of understanding the Enneagram in a deeper way. So, like, I think he does say when he presents the Enneagram in Search of Miraculous, he does say that the way he's presenting it, the diagram isn't complete. It's a kind of a partial expression, you could say, of the full, the full law or the full Enneagram. And so that you need to do something in order to be able to complete it. And so I think what he means by that is that you need to contemplate it, the Enneagram, work with it in these different ways, such that you can complete it inside yourself. It can only kind of be completed through a living experience, like we were saying with that second point of the Enneagram, that you have to kind of become it. It has to become something that you kind of are, or that you're knowing kind of through being it, rather than just knowing it through the knowledge. So that kind of presents a limitation to a kind of theoretical study of the Enneagram. That's not to say that you can't get any benefit from that, like just studying it kind of theoretically or through the mind, but just that's going to be, it's not going to provide a total understanding of it, So it does talk about, when he introduces the Enneagram, he talks about symbols. He introduces it as a symbol, and he kind of says that symbols, they have a kind of a different nature to them, a different reality to like normal language. Like the symbols, there's a language of symbols, and that language is a different kind of language from normal verbal language,
It kind of goes into the subconscious, doesn't it, as well as symbols?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just like that. Obviously, any symbol is much more kind of expansive in its meaning than a word. In our normal kind of verbal language, each word has a set meaning. Each word refers to one particular thing, you could say. Whereas with a symbol, it's not like a word in that sense. It doesn't just refer to one set thing or meaning or idea. They're much more like expansive. Like a symbol can encompass loads, almost like an infinity of ideas or meanings or subtleties, So there's like much more information, you could say, in a symbol than there is in a word, or just the idea that they're different kind of languages, So that would suggest again that there's a limitation if you're in understanding the Enneagram kind of through, you could say, through words, or just through that kind of thinking, that kind of language. You see what I mean? Like people can give you verbal, like I'm doing now, people can give you talks about the nature of the Enneagram, but obviously the nature of the language that we're using is going to be limited to, to expressing the nature of the Enneagram as a symbol. So I think you could say that the symbols are kind of like in the language of being, and so in order to kind of engage with it, you have to engage with it from your being. Do you see what I mean? It has to be like an inner, you could say like an inner work. Like you have to have some kind of inner material in you that you can kind of put into this symbol. You see what I mean? And that would have to be your own experiences, more the material of your own experiences than just ideas. So
it's like charging it, but then it's what you're putting in, isn't it? You don't want to be sitting there putting negativity into it, or worrying stuff or anything. You should be using it.
Yeah, or just look at it or just look at it in terms of what he says about mentation by form. Gurdjieff says that man has these two kinds of mind, or two kinds of thinking or mentation, one by like words and one by forms. So naturally you could say that symbols are geared to mentation by form, which again is not verbal mentation. It's like what you kind of understand of like the nature of shapes, or I don't know, like you could say geometry. It's like, again, there's this kind of a subconscious knowledge that you have, or your body has, in how it understands like geometry, and lines. It's like saying that there is a meaning to a triangle. There's some kind of essence of a triangle, some kind of information there, but how you get that, it's not through words. It's not through like the normal kind of mathematical study of a triangle. It's not just like look at it in terms of angles or maths or something like that. Again, that can be useful, but it's something much more direct. It's like literally a triangle has a certain meaning. I don't just mean that by a limited specific meaning, but it can be quite encompassing. And so you have to engage that kind of form of mind or contemplation, where
That's
you just
why it's
like
called sacred geometry, though, isn't it?
Yeah. It's just like it's like saying that you'd have to just literally like almost stare at it and try and get what it is saying, just in terms of the lines on the page or the shapes or something. Like even just in the shapes, there is there is something communicated there. It's like you might have to look at it and take away all your ideas about what it means and what it expresses, and there can be some direct communication or information just coming from the form, you know. And again, meditation by form is going to be much more the meanings that you get through meditation by form, they're going to be much more expansive rather than like these specific meanings that we equate with kind of verbal language, you know. Like you could say that the use of the primary use of symbols is to engage states of consciousness, you know, that's what they're supposed to work on. You know, you're supposed to use a symbol in order to, you could say, transform your being or your experience, you know, rather than just to know certain things.
Yeah, because I used to get that quite mixed up when I was younger and was involved in a few mystery schools or whatever. You know, I thought it was all about, say, the tarot, for example. I'd be looking at them thinking, why don't I understand? Why don't I ever remember what all these symbols mean? And it took me a long time to realise it gradually enters in.
Yeah.
When you're looking at them, then they start making sense and you're supposed to ponder on them. This is why the Rosicrucians and people, other groups like that, would ponder on certain symbols, wouldn't they?
Yeah. So yeah, I would definitely, I would say that I would say that engaging the Enneagram, again, I'm not denying all the kind of like theoretical study of it where you can use it to look into like literal physical processes. Like you could you could use the Enneagram to study science or look at how atoms or stuff behave. You know what I mean? You can use it in a very practical way, so it can be used for that. But there's also another, you know, you could say deeper side to it, or where it's talking about the nature of, you could say, consciousness or states of being, and you know, these higher laws that are not just involved in the physical world, but like the world of consciousness, the psychic world, and stuff like that. So I think back in the day, like back in the old schools, like, you know, Greece and things, you know, they didn't look at like geometry as just a normal science. They looked at it as something that you could say something sacred. And I think a lot of the way they contemplated it, symbols, was through that. They tried to engage their meditation by form. Like you could literally picture it as like just holding a shape in your mind, like a triangle, and trying to engage this other side, you could say this other side of your consciousness, your subconsciousness, or something that understands and speaks that language of symbols. You know?
Well, yeah, because
so
it's all part of, because that triangle's a perfect shape, isn't it? Or any of the sacred geometries are, and you're pondering on them instead of, you know, something like a teddy bear, for example.
Yeah.
I know you get all types of teddy bears, and teddy bears are cute and cuddly, but you don't ponder on a teddy bear to get that, what am I trying to say, that sacred form out of it, because instead you'll be going back to childhood memories or something. It's more of a chaotic form, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, you could look at the base shapes, you know, the basic geometric shapes. They're like the template or the basic forms through which all other, you know, shapes, you know, forms are created, isn't it? You know what I mean? Like if you're an artist, you kind of, a lot of the time you start by learning to look at things in terms of geometric shapes. Like a lot of people, when they're going to draw something, they'll kind of make a sort of geometric shape, say of a man that's very like square and boxy, or, you know, uses these ovals and these different geometric shapes. And then from that frame, you kind of do the detail and you work around it to give the sort, you know, so you can see they represent a kind of a scaffold, you know, a form or structure, and not just in the physical world, but also like in the mental world. You know, you could say that these shapes have a being not just in the physical world, but in the mental world. Like say a triangle has a certain meaning of its own in the mental world. You know, like say these shapes represent certain laws, and those laws are not just laws of proportion in terms of physical things. They can be like in terms of the mental world. So yeah, I definitely think that one of the ways to get something more from a symbol is you need to engage this meditation by form, or just engage the symbol in different ways. Like I say, maybe with the movements or painting a picture or something like that. Just this other kind of more artistic side of your nature needs to be engaged, I think. You know?
That definitely worked for me. I used to love my art when I was a teenager, and I failed my O level, which was very disappointing. That I failed my O level art. It was my favourite subject, so put me off art for years and years.
Oh no!
I came back to it in my 30s and 40s and fell in love with it all again. But I know I'm not a trained artist, but I know from studying it and looking up all the ancient art in like ancient Egypt or ancient India, all their sacred statues were built to a certain proportion.
Yeah.
I'm not saying different size, different size.
I know, yeah,
Everything was in proportion.
In proportion, yeah.
Yeah, so they'd have like the legs would be proportioned to a certain size to the body, to the
Yeah.
head, and they had all these blocks of how. So they had to learn that, didn't they? They had to learn sacred numbers, sacred geometry, like what you're saying, to make their objects sacred in the sacred geometry.
Yeah, well, there's that idea, like you're saying, that by shaping objects in a particular way, like you're saying, putting these proportions into them, it's like saying that they can have an effect on people. You know what I mean? So, I mean, that might be more or less like a sacred object that's structured that way might have more or less of an effect on different people, depending on, like, you know, how they can engage with it, what, you know, let's say what level that they're at or something like that. But they do say that it's kind of objective. Like, if these forms or proportions are embodied into some form, some shape, some object, then it expresses these laws, and that means it has a certain power to it. It will have a certain influence, you know. But people might be able to respond to that influence in different ways. So again, it's like saying those physical objects, or those kind of laws and proportions that are embodied in them, they're not just at the physical level, but again at the level of the emotions and the psyche, you know. And that's again
the sacred buildings as well, like Gurdjieff would say, doing that to the sacred buildings, then you've got that special energy being created in that building because it's all built to a certain sacred geometry alignment.
So again, in that sense, you're kind of looking at like geometrical shapes then as like having these sort of powers, or having their own essence. Like we were saying, it's like a triangle has its own essence, has its own being, has some quality to it, and that can express in different ways. And one way it can express is in terms of how it affects people's state, psyche. So again, we could use symbols not just to affect other people, but like I say, in ourselves. Do you see what I mean? I can invoke maybe if I invoke the nature of the triangle in myself, that it brings a certain kind of certain understanding.
When you say that, I think of the Mr. Men for some reason. In shapes, triangle. One of my favourite books which is very hard to get, but if you can, was it Roger Hargreaves who did the Mr. Men?
I think so.
Be a roundie, not a squarey. And when I read it again a few years ago, it was like he was writing all about how sacred geometry and how to be a round person, you know, you're more willing to go with the roll of things rather than a blocked square. Stuck in your way. And I'm like, he's teaching us all this when we were children in this delightful little Mr. Men book.
I see what you mean now. I never really thought of it that way.
No, I hadn't until I used to love it.
I used to love that. I used to watch it as a cartoon when I was a kid, you know, the programs on TV. But what you're saying kind of makes sense, that it would kind of make sense for a certain character, you know, a certain human character to be expressed in a certain shape. You know, there'd be shapes that are more compatible, say an angry person, than a particular shape, probably a spiky shape or something like that, would be more correspondent to an angry person than a round shape or something like that. So again, it's strange that you could suggest that these shapes have a certain kind of emotional meaning to them, you know, that's not arbitrary. You know, people could say, oh, well, it's just, you know, it's just some random association that makes you link anger with spikiness rather than, you know, roundness. But maybe there's an objective kind of meaning there, you know, again, which means that we can use these shapes or contemplate them to evoke different kind of, like, again, what we're saying with like states of consciousness, you know, which is like how they're used in magic, isn't it, really? Like you contemplate the shape in order to evoke the kind of like power or qualities that are associated with that shape, you know.
And we're using that magic to create ourselves and to be the magicians we want to be, so that we're working the magic for us and everybody else.
It just suggests that there's this whole other layer of kind of meaning there that we are being affected by, but mostly subconsciously, but that we can become more conscious to it, you know. So I was just going to say that if we're contemplating a symbol, it's kind of probably dependent on our sort of well, let's just call it the mental energy, for want of a better word, that you have to have a certain mental vitality that enables you to contemplate the symbol or use the symbol in a way that it's, you could say, be meant to be used, or the actual tap into the potential that's there. Like if I don't have the kind of mental energy, then that I'm not really going to be able to connect with that the meaning there, because it's like in order to connect with that meaning, I have to do something, even if that's just internally, you know, like what we were saying with the shocks in the enneagram. I have to come up to a state that's kind of got an affinity, you know, a closeness to the symbol in order to be able to make the connection or to connect to it. So if I haven't got the kind of mental energy, then I'm not going to be able to do that. But I don't mean my mental energy like some normal idea of cleverness, you know.
No.
It'd be more like, yeah, how attuned you are to your own mind, you know, how kind of subtle your attention is in being able to pick up what's going on in your mind, or how able you are to evoke certain mental states.
Or what frame of mood you're in at that time.
Yeah.
You might, because I used to think that if you were in a bad mood, maybe that's a good time to meditate to calm you down. But I was actually reading a book by, it's about the Dalai Lama and the 13th Dalai Lama, and he was advising this guy, no, you must never meditate when you're in a bad mood. That's the worst time to do it, because you're bringing all that into your meditation. You know,
right.
You should only be meditating when you want to, and you're in a good mood or feeling more tranquil or not something. You know, you don't go and do something if you're not in the right mood to do it. Like what you're just saying now, if you've not got the mental effort because you're not in the right frame of mind, it's not the time to do it. You need to go and put yourself into the right frame of mind, then go and do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there needs to be like your state needs to be kind of correspondent to whatever it is that you're after or that you're going to be engaged in. There needs to be a certain mutuality, or it's unlikely. I mean, it's possible that maybe you could start a meditation being pissed off and something could change and maybe it could work out. But yeah, there's got to be more resistance there.
Yes.
You know, if you're approaching it from that kind of a state to begin with. But what I was going to say
that's what he was saying, actually. I should have put that across. You said it exactly. It's the resistance that's the problem.
Yeah, or just the idea of timing, isn't it? There's like, you know, the idea that there's a time for every season. Also, there's like, and being sensitive to that, you know, being sensitive to recognize the moment when it's, I mean, that's like the idea of, is it the kairos, you know, the idea of like Christ, and, you know, so there's like there's moments where there's more potential for something, you know, there's moments that are ripe for something to be done. And if you can recognize those moments and, you know, act in accordance with them, then you can get more results. It's like that idea with the tides. You know, there's that idea, isn't there, that every seventh wave or something that comes in on the shore is bigger or something like that. So if you were going to, I think that's true. If you watch the waves, you'll see that there seems to be a regular pattern in that every so often there'll be a bigger wave that comes up more of the shore, you know. And so that if you could see that bigger wave, then if you wanted to set sail your ship, you'd be riding on the extra momentum that's there. So again, this idea about being sensitive to these moments of opportunity, and that's the essence of the enneagram, because like it's saying that there are these points, and each of those points has a certain quality to it, which facilitates something to be done, you know. So if you can recognize where you are in the enneagram, then that's like being sensitive to the moment, to the opportunity. What is the extra potential that's there in the moment, you know. And I was just going to say that kind of you could look at the contemplation of symbols, like trying to engage this sort of meditation by form, or this side of yourself that kind of speaks the language of shape or geometry, that you could look at that in terms of at least part of the development of your inner bodies. Because like in contemplating the symbol, again, it's like you introduce this symbol into your mind stuff and it can organize it and shape it. So like these symbols can be transformative to your mind by contemplating on them, you know. So you could look at that transformation that happens through engaging these symbols as kind of like something like a transformation of your mind, or the transformation of the stuff that forms these higher bodies, you know. Like you could look at, particularly say then the Kesdjan body, as like it's like your means. You could say it's your very means to engage that kind of contemplation or meditation by form. You know, you could say that that's the meditation of your, if you like, your Kesdjan body, or how it can develop through exercise and that kind of meditation. You know,
that is how we develop it, though, isn't it? By forming it through mentation, which is why it gives us the sitting exercises and the color exercises, because you're forming your Kesdjan body.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could look at it in like loads of things as, you know, as playing a part in that process, like even just your daily interactions with people and trying to be nice and bear the unpleasant manifestations of others. You could look at all of that as having as having some, you know, effect on your Christian body. But yes, specifically those kind of inner exercises, and particularly like work with this sort of language of forms and shapes, you know. I mean, you could look at that as a mental language, or you could look at it as an emotional language. Either way, but it's definitely a different kind of language to what we use in our normal mind and words, you know. So yeah, in contemplating them, you can maybe develop your Christian body, and that might be like a body that's able to navigate that world of, like, you know, that kind of meaning, and access that meaning and deal with it, like we're saying, you know, respond to it, or you be able to use those kind of shapes in a more intentional way, in the sense of evoking, you know, states in yourself, because the Christian body is described that way, that when it's formed, it serves as a source of authority over your physical body, you know. So it can kind of like it can kind of control that, or you can just look at it again as something that has a greater authority over your internal states. It can work with the energy of like thought, feeling, and sensation in a more sort of conscious or intentional, creative way. You know, it's the means to be like, yeah, it's the body that you can actually use for inner alchemy. You know, it's like it takes an alchemy to develop that body, but once it's developed, then yeah, you can access another layer, you know, another layer of it, and that's how he says that, you know, the higher body, the soul, can develop from the Christian body.
Well, it is all layers, isn't it? I think sometimes, I know people do get confused about it. You know, it took me a long while to figure about when people used to talk about your higher self, or why can't I get to my higher self? Or your higher self's always trying to contact you.
Yeah.
And it's us having to make the effort to go up to the higher self. And like when you were saying about the enneagram before, and you get to 8, and number 9's kind of pulling you to it.
Yeah.
You know, hopefully that's your higher self.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you could look at that. I was going to say conscience. I think what he talks about is sacred conscience. I suppose particularly in Beelzebub's Tales, he kind of says that that's the only means that's left to man to develop. It's only the presence of conscience in him, the fact that there is still this conscience in man that's in his subconscious. It's only through the engagement of that he can actually, you know, develop. That's his only means. And so you could look at conscience in that sense as like the means of your higher self to communicate to you, you know. And because the conscious is in your subconscious, it's like you have to receive a communication through your subconsciousness from, you say, your higher self. And so I would say that one way of looking at conscience then is it gives you that insight into, or can give you an insight into your kind of, what they would say, like your destiny or your fate.
Yeah.
You know, like in Search of the Miraculous, Goethe says there's these like different laws that we can be under. Like there's the law of accident, and the law of fate, and the kind of the law of destiny or will. So I suppose the law of accident is fairly self-explanatory in the sense that it says when that law is operating, or when you're under that law, your life and your states are a bit more chaotic or accidental. Like there isn't as much of a correspondence between the circumstances of your life and the things that you do and the people that you meet. There isn't much of a correspondence between that and your essence. You know? Like the outer conditions aren't really mirroring your essence or providing what it needs. You see what I mean? So like the first stages of the work, you could say, look at getting beyond accident in terms of gaining some connection to your individual essence and like what it needs. And so gaining that contact would mean that your life started to kind of more express your essence and start to provide it with what it needs. So you could look at conscience as like when you connect to that, or the influences you can receive through your conscience, they can give you insight into your essence then, which is connected to your fate. Like he says, every essence type has a certain fate, you know, attached to it. So it's like saying, if we link them with the astrological signs, then I suppose it's like saying every astrological sign is an essence type. But obviously within that astrological sign, there's a certain amount of variation. Not every Capricorn is an exact clone of every other Capricorn. So there's variations within that type. So it's like gaining knowledge of your essence would be gaining knowledge of the basic type, the Capricorn essence, but also gaining some insight into your individual expression of that Capricorn essence. And that would be like getting connections to your fate. And so that can kind of give you higher impressions coming via your conscience, through your subconsciousness, about your life. Like that could express in literal insights into what's going to happen to you in terms of your future and your events. And it can also give you just an insight at the level of the kind of meaning, you could say, something like what your life is going to be about, you know, the central essence that expresses in all these various circumstances that you come into it. So if you know your essence, you could say that's like knowing your higher, connecting with your higher self. It gives you a kind of perception of yourself that's not limited to time, you know. It's like knowing yourself beyond what you do, knowing yourself beyond all the things that you engage in. So that'd be like getting to the crux of like what your incarnation's about, almost, you know. It's like saying every essence has some kind of unique thing that it's here to do, and that's kind of again linked to the notion of the higher self, that everybody has to an extent an individual higher self, something unique about it. So it's like every person has a unique kind of task that they're here to, or a unique work that they're here to engage in, you know. So yeah, connected with your conscience can give you insight into what your life's about, you know, what that sort of essence is, what your type is, or what you're here to do, or your particular kind of work that you're going to be engaged in, you know. So yeah, it would.
Oh, go on. Sorry.
So yeah, I think that conscience, then, moments of connection with conscience can give you insights at that level of your higher self, you could say, the part of you that's not kind of limited by time and space. It sort of it exists outside of time and space, you could say, relatively, compared to like the personality. You know, it's like your personality is kind of like your means of engaging with the physical world. You know, it gives you access to the material world. You know, it's like the essence is kind of non-material. It's you could say non-existence. It's not like of the nature of the, you know, matter. You know, it doesn't exist in time and space. So it needs some means of incarnation, and obviously that's connected to the body, but also the personality. You know, the personality serves to give it a foothold in the material world and to receive physical impressions and to be able to act in the, you know, the physical realm. So the essence needs to feed off the personality. But yeah, just that essence itself, gaining an insight into that through conscience, could be connecting with your higher self.
I did a show recently on conscience.
Right.
And I was doing all my notes. I was like stunned to come across a piece in Margaret Anderson's, I'm sure it was Margaret Anderson's book.
Right.
And she says that Gurdjieff told her that conscience is the divine spark. It's God in us. And I was like, wow, it was like a real revelation. I knew that, but I needed to be told it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, like he calls it like the representative of the creator, I think, in Beelzebub. The conscience in man is what kind of shows that man is connected to God. It's like what is, you could say, it's almost what is of God in man. But again, I would say that it like he says, conscience is different to morality. So it's like he says, morality are all these ideas that people can acquire about right and wrong, and obviously that can be different due to where you are in the world. Obviously, there's lots of different morals and moral ideas depending where you're born in the world. You know, so he says conscience is different to that. It's not informed by external situations and people. It's kind of like, say, objective. It's not subjective in that sense. But I would say that its very nature is individual. He does say that conscience expresses the same in every man. So you could say that every man with conscience will have a certain mutuality, be a certain similarity, but how conscience bids each man to act can be different. You know, like it doesn't mean that everybody's going to act the same way if they're operating through conscience, because you could say that the nature of conscience is what can inform you as to your individual essence, you know, your individuality. Conscience is there to enable you to develop this individual essence, you know, your own individuality. So there's going to be something unique in how conscience expresses through every person, because it's to do with that very essence of God in each person, and that expresses in kind of a unique way, you know. So yeah, connected with conscience is like, yeah, you could say connected with the seed of God in you, and also what can connect you to you, the real I, you know, or your real individuality, you know, something that's unique to you, you know.
Well, I'm going to draw this to a close because we're coming up to an hour. That was very interesting. Well, I found it quite fascinating talking about anything to do with Gurdjieff, so I always enjoy it. So what we're saying is, you know, that enneagram is a moving symbol, isn't it? and we're taking part of it in everything that we do can be related to the Enneagram. It's like a pathway. If anybody studies Kabbalah, it's like going up the ladder of the Kabbalah tree.
Yeah.
The Enneagram is going round and up and down and round.
Yeah. So I was just saying that, people can contemplate it in different ways. It does seem to be, like earlier says, a cosmic or like universal symbol. So people can study it from any angle or could apply it to anything. You see what I mean? In essence. But yes, he does more talk about it in terms of the nature of phenomena and processes and how things are interrelated and how they maintain themselves and also how they develop, how, like we say, how things can realize their own potential, their own individuality.
And your books are still available on Amazon, aren't they?
Yeah. There's I think there's only one available at the moment. It's called Reflections on the Bezel Hub's Tales. So people could look at that. Or there's my WordPress site, which is just Beelzebub's Tales. People could find it if they want.
Oh, that was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. I think we went round the Enneagram and back again. So we're up at number 9. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. It's good.
Soon.
Yeah, definitely.
People look out for Mr. Men, Mr. Roundy, books. They're very hard to get hold of, going for £40 on eBay.
Really? Jesus.
Yes. So I think I have to get in touch with the publishers and say, bring them back out again.
Yeah, do.
All right, then. Thank you. I shall end the show here. Thanks for watching, everybody.